Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name is Lucy Moore and I'm a Professional Education Manager at ACCA. Our session today is designed to support your preparation for the Advanced Audit and Assurance exam, whether you're taking the paper exam or the CBE, and I'm very pleased to be joined by an expert tutor, Ben Wilson. Ben, can I just ask you to say a very quick hello and introduce yourself before I explain how the session will work?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session. As Lucy said, my name is Ben Wilson. I'm going to be leading you through the majority of the session today. It's going to be mainly working through a past exam question from AAA, but it'll also be the opportunity for you to ask questions as well, which I'll try to answer during the session.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so you should be able to see the agenda on your screens now. So as Ben mentioned, he's going to be kicking off the session with his top 3 tips for tackling AAA and how to earn marks in the exam. And then we're actually going to be playing you a video that Ben has recorded in advance. And in this video, Ben, as he said, works a key question from a past exam, illustrating good exam technique, pitfalls to avoid, as well as giving you some really excellent guidance on how to debrief your own answers during question practice. We're actually going to start with a quick poll question. And this might take 10 or 15 seconds to show on your screens, but what we'd really love to know from you is whether you're going to be taking AAA as a paper-based exam or as a computer-based exam, and that's just to give us a sense of who we've got in the audience. As I said, the advice that Ben will be giving is relevant whether or not you're preparing for the paper-based or the computer-based exam. The visuals that you see in the video that Ben has already recorded is focused on the CBE environment, but the advice that he's giving about, exam techniques and so on, many of them will be relevant for paper exams as well. So I'm hoping that you can see the poll question on screen. Are you going to be taking AAA as a paper-based exam or a computer-based exam? So just a couple more seconds and I'm going to move on to the results and see what we have. Okay, so the results coming up for me are just over 60% of you in the audience are actually preparing for the CBE, and we've got just under 40% preparing for the paper-based exam. So that's quite interesting. Ben, I'm going to hand over to you at this point, and it would be great if you can reflect on those poll results as well before moving on to your top tips.
Sure. Well, the tips I'm going to give you today are relevant for both versions of the exam paper, as Lucy said. They are more focused on, there's a couple that are specific to the CBE software, but I'll be sort of highlighting the things I'd be doing if I was doing paper-based as well, because I can see that such a big proportion of you are still sitting the paper-based exam. Okay, first top tip for passing AAA. It is a narrative, wordy exam paper with long scenarios. It's very easy to run out of time in the exam, and there's often evidence of time pressure in students' scripts. So first tip, no waffle, no filler. We're going for short, concise points. What we're really looking at is 1 or 2 sentences per point, and each point being kind of, 2 lines, perhaps maximum, before you leave a gap to your next point. I would encourage you to allocate time to each specific requirement. So I'm kind of going, well, section A of the exam is 50 marks. So I know I need to be done with section A through, half the exam time. But I'm going more micro than that. I'm looking at each individual requirement and I'm allocating myself 1.8 minutes per mark. Give myself a rough guide of where I need, how long I've got for each requirement. Now, 1.8 is a little bit under the amount of time that you actually have. So if you're aiming at 1.8 minutes per mark, that allows you your time to slip a little bit. And this is a great tip. Start the first question as if you are already running out of time. It's very interesting when you look at students' exam scripts, very often the first couple of questions, they write loads, absolutely loads, and they do waffle. But they really go to town on the first question because there's still 3 hours left of the exam. I've got loads of time. And then when you get through to the last questions on the paper, actually they're really running out of time and there's huge evidence of time pressure. But that evidence of time pressure really shows itself towards the end of the exam. And here's the hint, or here's the significance of that. Very often, the easiest marks on the paper are at the end. They design lots of exam papers like that, and AAA is no exception. So if you get to the end of the exam with a decent amount of time available, you've got a good amount of time to take that low-hanging fruit, the easier marks that are available there. So make sure you start fast and you get to the end of the paper with a good amount of time. Tip 2 is around answer planning. Now, this is really designed around using the CBE software. So if you're doing the paper-based exam, then what I'd be encouraging you to do is to have a brief set of notes as your answer plan on your writing as your on your exam paper, and then you're writing up that full answer. So when I'm planning my answer, if I'm doing the computer-based version, I do my answer plan in the software. So I'm not doing any handwritten notes, and I'm not using the scratch pad or anything like that. I'm doing my answer plan actually in the requirement part where I submit my answer. And the reason for that is if I run out of time or I don't get to expand out any of my points, then the software will submit my answer plan, and I might still pick up a few marks. So when I'm doing the plan, I'm writing just 1 or 2 short words, and you're going to see me doing this with a question in it shortly. And then when it comes to writing up my answer, I'm expanding out each of those short points into a longer point. Now, whether you're sitting the computer-based or the paper-based exam, I would strongly encourage you to plan. And the reason for that is that if you come up with an answer plan to start with, you already know the points you're going to write. You can then write them really succinctly and briefly when it comes to writing them up. If you're thinking of your point and writing it up at the same time, that's when students tend to waffle. They tend to write much shorter, more succinct points if they've already thought of the answer and then they're writing up their point. So planning helps you to write less while still covering the same amount of content. My next tip is in AAA, as an advanced level exam, you really have to add depth to your points for you to score a higher mark. You know, in the audit risk question that you often get in section A, it'll say up to 3 marks per well-explained risk, up to 3 marks. And a lot of students will only earn half a mark or 1 mark for their risk because they don't develop it fully. Develop your points to pick up the extra 2 marks that are available rather than just getting the superficial marks. So here are my tips. Firstly, I mine the scenario. I try to use, in fact, every point in AAA, I try to start with a fact from the scenario. And that fact often picks me up half a mark. I then think about what is the impact of that fact. I ask myself the question, so what? What does it mean for the future of the business? Why is this a risk? Can I develop it in some way? And another thing I try to do is I try to think about who else does this point have an impact on? What's the impact on customers? What's the impact on my staff? What's the impact on management, my shareholders? But by thinking of the impact on different groups, then it helps me to develop that point to think of a kind of, to develop it more further so that I can pick up extra half marks and marks. Every time I add a bit of development onto my point in AAA, I'm kind of picking up an extra half mark or a mark. Right, we're now going to have a look at a question from the September-December 19 sample questions. These questions are available up on the ACCA's website, and if you want to get the, if you want to have a look at the, so get the question paper up, you'll be able to follow it more closely if you've got the questions there. This recording will be available to you after today's session. As Lucy mentioned, it will be available tomorrow, so you'll be able to watch back if there is anything that you do miss. But what you're going to see is me putting into practice lots of those tips that I've just gone through in that top tips section. We're using the sample questions from the September-December 2019 AAA exam, which you can get from the ACCA's website. We're going to focus specifically on a question from section A of the exam. We're going to look at part D, this ethics question down here. Now I'm going to work in one of the ACCA's blank workspaces, which again you can access on the ACCA's website. The idea of using this blank workspace is that I get used to using the word processor and spreadsheet functionality so I can improve how I use the software. So it's more familiar to me on the day of the exam. Opening up the word processor then, and I want to set up my page so that the word processor is big enough that I can type my answer into it, but I'm not covering the navigator and next buttons down the bottom here. So I'm going to have it fairly large there. And that word processor is where I'm going to do my answer plan and then type my answer. Now, if this is a question that's actually loaded into the ACCA software, the CBE software, then I would bring up my question here. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to have the question paper shown on screen as well so that I can work in the way that I would if the question was actually loaded up. So first bit of technique and first tip that I gave you earlier was around time management. Now, section A of the exam, 50 marks, therefore half the paper. So I've got just about half of the time available here. So just over an hour and a half to do part A of the exam. And this particular requirement, part D, is 10 marks. Now, I budget 1.8 minutes per mark, knowing that I'm going to go over at certain points of the exam. So that's going to be about 18 minutes I'll give myself to do this particular requirement. And although this is part D, a useful tip for you is to look for which of the requirements you find most straightforward and to do those ones first. Build your confidence, take the low-hanging fruit, do the easier parts of the question first, and accumulate the 50 marks that you need to pass the exam. I think part D here is actually the easiest part of this entire question, so I would be doing this first in the exam. So my technique, I start by copying and pasting the requirement into the word processor, into my answer, because that's going to form the basis of my structure and my answer plan. Like so many of the questions in the AAA exam, this part D does actually include more than one requirement. So the first part of this requirement is to discuss any ethical issues. So that will form the first part of my answer structure relevant to the group audit. And then the second part of my answer structure will be to recommend appropriate actions to be taken by our firm. And I've got to use the notes from the audit committee phone call in Exhibit 5. So let's get that up on screen. Okay, so in this planning time, what I'll be doing is going through each of the pieces of information I'm given about this audit committee call and picking out ethical issues. And as I pick out each ethical issue, I'm going to bring it into the word processor to form my answer plan. So the first paragraph here, there's an issue. They've asked the senior partner from the audit firm to become a member of the client's audit committee. Okay, that's one issue. And I'm thinking, why is that an issue? Well, I might end up making decisions that become audited. I'm part of management decision making there. That's a self-review threat, isn't it? That also immediately thinks in my mind, I might end up making decisions, and that is not something that the auditor is allowed to do. That's a management threat, isn't it? And are there any other threats that I think might come out of this? Yeah, someone looking from the outside might look at this and think that we're a bit too close. The relationship is a little bit too cozy. That's a familiarity threat, isn't it? Okay, that's my first issue, the senior partner. Next issue, second paragraph. We're being asked if we can recommend another firm to perform some corporate finance work. So let's bring that into our answer. And actually, we learn in the third paragraph that there is a referral fee of 10% of the associate's fee for this engagement. So we're going to make some money out of this. Now, why is that an issue? That we're going to make a recommendation and we're going to make some money out of it. I think that gives us a self-interest threat because we're going to benefit from this. My technique in an ethics question, if I'm struggling to think of, are there any further ethical implications? I then run through the other threats. So advocacy, self-interest, self-review, management, intimidation, and familiarity. Now I've already got familiarity up here, so I'm not going to go for that one again. I think self-interest is the most obvious one here. I don't think any of the others really leap out at me. So back into the scenario. Oh, I'm going to be asked to design some internal controls and evaluate the operating effectiveness of internal controls. If I'm going to be testing the controls that I've designed, then clearly there's a self-review threat. Are there any other obvious ethical issues though? So I'm doing my technique, running through intimidation, familiarity, advocacy, self-interest, self-review, management. Any of those others seem like they apply? I mean, this is very similar to the first point, but it is going to be around me making decisions. If I'm designing these internal controls, that's a management threat. I'm going to be designing the controls. Okay, so I've got 3 areas of issue here, 3 ethical issues that I've got an answer plan now. I'm going to go on and do my answer plan for the next part of the question, recommend appropriate actions to be taken by our firm. And I'm going to do those in each of the 3 areas noted above. Now, it might feel a little bit clunky to have a separate section for this for the recommendations, but I want to make sure that I've definitely got recommendations for each. So I like to answer each part of the question separately. Now, this first issue, the senior partner becoming a member of the group audit committee, I know from my knowledge, my revision of the ethical standards, I know this isn't allowed. This is prohibited. So my action here is going to be to refuse to do this piece of work. Providing a recommendation for another firm to perform the corporate finance work and getting paid a referral fee to it. That referral fee of 10%, well, actually, it's not that huge a percentage, but it could be a big financial fee, couldn't it? So I'm going to want to do a bit more investigation on this one. I'm going to need to look at the size of the fee. Now I'm going to use one of my techniques that I use in an ethics question, which is to kind of go through my checklist of standard suggestions. Now, because the first one I know is something that's prohibited, surely the second thing isn't also going to be prohibited. That would be a strange way to design a question if it's the same answer to various parts of it. And so my kind of standard suggestions of things that are sensible are to do things like discuss with the ethics partner at my own firm, and perhaps disclose it to those charged with governance. The third issue around designing these internal controls over revenue and evaluate the operating effectiveness of the internal controls. I know this is going to involve significant management decision making, and so that's something that is not allowed. And so I'm going to have to refuse this engagement. There we go. We now have an answer plan to this part of the question. Now, I would be in section A, I'm doing my answer plan for each part. So for this part, part D, and then I would write up my answer to part D immediately, whilst all of these ideas are still fresh in my mind. One of the beauties of having an answer plan like this is because I've now thought of all of my ideas. When it comes to typing my answer, I can be much more succinct, much more brief in the way that I type, because I already know what I'm going to say. Another advantage of having an answer plan like this is that if I do run out of time in the exam, so let's say this is the last question I was doing and the clock was really ticking, my answer plan would be submitted. Now, it's not going to score me full marks, obviously, because my points haven't been developed and explained, but it could pick me up the odd mark here or there. Certainly it stands a better chance of earning some marks than nothing at all if I hadn't done the answer plan and I was submitting a blank screen. Let's now have a look at turning this answer plan into a full written answer. We need to be taking into account the verb that has been used in the question. So this is a discussion question. The verb is to discuss, and therefore I need a reasonable amount of detail, 1 or 2 sentences to explain each point. It's not state or list, it's discuss, and therefore I need to chew the fat a bit. Let's take this first point then, which was our self-review threat, where the senior partner might be helping to make decisions as a member of the audit committee, which are then audited as part of the review of the financial statements. Now, as that answer stands, self-review threat exists. The senior partner may make decisions that are reflected in the financial statements. Now, that's not currently enough. Because that would be that's not I need to more fully explain what the real issue is around that self-review thing. I need to develop that point more effectively.
So why is that a problem if my partner makes decisions that are reflected in the financial statements? When I'm doing the audit, I'm less likely to challenge more robustly, and I'm more likely to accept issues at face value because the senior partner has been involved in them. That's better. I've now developed this point more fully because I've said why it's an issue for the audit. The junior auditors are less likely to challenge any explanations given by the partner, and they're more likely to overlook any issues that do arise. Things to highlight to you in the way that I've written there. Notice that I've kept self-review as the first words in the sentence, the first words in this point, because that directs the marker, that tells them what this point is about. And I've kept my points short. They're not notes, but they are brief. And I've developed my points, but I've done it without waffling. I'm going for a short, punchy style. Let's move on to the next one. This was a management threat because I might make decisions on behalf of management because this is a senior, potentially decision-making role as part of the audit committee. Let's follow that technique approach I gave you about mining the scenario. One of the things we're told here is that there are 3 non-exec directors on the audit committee, and they're looking for, there was a 4th who is now left. So I'm going to be one of the 4. So I'm going to have an influential position because I'm one of the 4 decision makers on here. So I've used that technique of taking an extra fact out of the scenario and using it to kind of develop my point. The final one we came up with here was about familiarity, that a third party might look at this and think the relationship is too close and too cozy. Now, the point of that, why is that an issue if there's a close relationship that develops? Well, the partner might challenge them less robustly, might accept them at face value, might less professional skepticism. And the other point is that a reasonable third party might consider that the objectivity of the auditor is compromised. They're too close. Okay, things to point out to you here. I've made 3 points here, and they're all separate. This one's about self-review. You know it's about self-review because it starts there. I've left a gap when I'm talking about my management threats, and I've left a gap talking about familiarity. And I've kept my sentences as short as possible. Short, punchy points, but I am still developing my answer fully. Next up, the self-interest threat around the fee that I'm earning from the corporate finance work. Okay, now I need to develop that self-interest threat. It needs to be significant enough to influence my behavior. And the point with self-interest is that I'm benefiting when the business does well in some way. So I'm saying the audit firm would benefit if the referral is taken up. So it will encourage us to really try to persuade this group to take our recommendation. Okay, next up, the self-review threat around the testing of controls. And I need to try to explain this in a way that is different to the self-review threat up here. So it's not about decisions in the financial statements. It's about decisions around the robustness of the controls, isn't it? Now, I have really made the same points here. Firstly, I'm not going to do the job as thoroughly. So I'm not going to test the controls robustly. And if I do find a problem, I don't want to say anything about it because it makes me look bad. Now that's really the same points that I've made up here, but I've used different language, different terminology, and I'm explaining them in context of that particular issue. So because it's a subtly different answer, I'm confident that I'm going to get the marks down here too. Next up, the management threat around designing the controls. I'm keeping my point short and sweet. Because it's a discuss question, I'm using 1 or 2 sentences per point to flesh it out. Now you'll notice that I've been using bold type. And I'm doing that so that the answer has more visual impact for you as you're reviewing my work here. Now, in the exam, I probably wouldn't waste time with the bold typing. It's probably not a good use of your scarce time. It's definitely worth spending the time structuring your answer and having it set out with gaps so it's easier to mark, but probably not worth the time on bold typing. Right, so the actions. Senior partner becoming a member of the group audit committee. So this we said is prohibited, it's not allowed. But I kind of want to say, so recommend, it's not saying state appropriate actions. Recommend I'm kind of going, I need a little bit of detail here. So I'm kind of explaining a little bit about why, and it's because the ethical issues are too great. And developing my point about refusing the work, I don't just want to say that. I want to give a kind of, what would I say instead? These are a client, they're an important client of my firm. I don't just want to say no. I want to say something that is going to be, I can't do it, but here's something else. Now that might score a mark, it might not. It's a practical thing that I would suggest that they do. But because it's only a short point, I've not wasted a long time explaining it. And this is something that you often find with students. If they're making a point that's a bit weak, they often keep going with it. If I keep explaining this weak point, I keep going with it, I explain it more and more, it might become worth a mark. And it doesn't become worth a mark. If it's weak, it's weak. Don't waste too much time on it. Keep your point short and punchy. That way, if they don't score, you haven't wasted too much time. For our second issue, which was recommending another firm to perform the corporate finance work, we said they need to assess the size of the fee, and we'd look at it in relation to our practice income. Now, if you're seeing the UK version of the paper, you'll know that for a public interest entity, that those threshold limits are 5% and 10%. At 5%, we need to apply safeguards, and at 10%, we need to review whether or not at 10%, we need to refuse the work. That's for the UK version of the paper. For the international version, we would just leave our point there. The point about the ethics partner or a senior unrelated partner, we should discuss with them and get their advice on relevant safeguards. And I kind of want to go, well, what are those safeguards? What kind of things could I put in place? For example, doing an enhanced internal quality control review. This final point about disclosing to those charged with governance is about getting there, kind of making sure that everybody knows that this exists, and we're documenting it, so they're kind of making an informed decision. That those charged with governance are aware of this. It's not just management that are decision makers at the company that are kind of aware of this issue. Okay, again, notice the points are short and punchy. Disclose to those charged with governance and obtain written confirmation that they're aware of the fee structure and are comfortable with it. And notice I didn't leave that abbreviation, TCWG. Now, in the exam, if you really push for time, you could leave that abbreviation in there. The problem for you, though, is that you are going to be in section A. If you leave abbreviations in, you're probably going to lose a professional skills mark. So in section A, I wouldn't have left that in there. In section B, I'd have been a bit more tempted. Final bit is about the recommendations around the internal controls work. And this is prohibited under the ethical standard. It's the management threat, isn't it? So decision making is not allowed for public interest in entities, for PIs, for listed companies. So we're going to refuse the work, but because I don't want to say recommend someone else to do it, because that's what I set up here, I'm going to say instead that I could do a smaller version of this. So I could just do the evaluating the operating effectiveness, but not do the advisory work on the controls themselves. So I'm refusing that work, but I'm suggesting that to design the controls, but I'm suggesting that I could do the second part of the project, which is evaluating the operating effectiveness, because that doesn't involve decision making. Once you've written your answer, it's a really good idea to try to maximize the value that you get out of that question, enhance your learning as much as possible by using all of the resources that the ACCA makes available to you. Firstly, the examiner's answer. Now we're going to take a look at that, and I'm going to show you the things I would use it for, and I'm going to give you some advice on things definitely not to do with it. It can be a bit dangerous. Next, the marking scheme, really useful for you to be thinking about how different types of question get assessed in the AAA exam, because it helps you to decide and to drive how you write your answers. It's worth noting those marking schemes often say 1 mark per well-explained point, and it can be really hard for you to know whether your own answer is well explained enough. So I'll be giving you a few tips on how you can work that out, but also my advice there is if you do have the opportunity to get someone to mark your script, if you're studying with an approved learning provider, for example, then make sure you submit your answers for marking and get that feedback. It's really helpful to get someone else's opinion. We're also going to consider how you use the examiner's report, really, really useful resource that's published after each exam sitting, and there's some really useful stuff you can get out of it. So let's take a look at the examiner's answer for that question we just looked at. And here it is. It's a thing of beauty. The examiner has obviously spent a lot of time constructing this answer. They've had a lot of time to think about it, to plan it. And it also goes through quite a lot of review. So they'll add points into the answer once they've had some of the technical moderation has happened of the question. This answer gets developed and fleshed out over time. But it has definitely not been written in 18 minutes. In fact, this answer is about 650 words. Our answer that we came up with there was just over 400 words. So it's hugely longer. And obviously it would score full marks, but it's very demoralizing. This is not something that is achievable in the amount of time that you have available. So when I'm using the model answers, I am not trying to memorize them for rote learning. And I'm also not trying to use them for answer style. For example, here, this long opening sentence, which is restating information from the scenario, yes, it adds to the quality of the answer. It makes it better structured, but I haven't got time to write like that in the exam. I need to make short points so I can cover more content. So to reiterate, don't rote learn and don't copy them in terms of style because you will not have time to write like this in the exam. So what can you use this answer for then? Well, it's the content. It's reading through it and going, oh, when I was writing my answer, I didn't talk about the self-interest threat in this context. So I can actually now understand some of the content that I potentially could have included in my answer. But I'm not saying I need to write everything that's in here to pass the question. So I'm using it to pick out points that I perhaps missed. On to looking at the marking scheme. Now, the marking scheme is contained within the same document, the answers that are published on the ACCA's website, but the marking scheme is at the back of this document. Here, down on page 24, we've got the marking scheme for that question that we just looked at. And the thing that's useful for me here is they're telling me how many marks are available for each of the points. So I'm getting from this, if it's a discussion question, I know that generally there will be 1 mark for each of the points that I make. So I need to explain up to 10 points to get the 10 marks. And actually, if you look at this as a sort of checklist down here, this is much easier to review in terms of content for things that I missed than the actual examiner's model answer is. These are often more useful. So I actually use the marking scheme more than I use the examiner's detailed comments. How can I decide whether I explained my self-review threat thoroughly? That's really subjective, isn't it? And well, what would I have needed to have done to explain that self-review threat? Well, that's what they're showing you in the examiner's answer. Here it is. Should I take this over? A self-review threat exists because I can exert influence over the financial statements and the audit team would be less likely to challenge issues during the audit, thereby losing their professional skepticism. That's the level of detail that they're expecting from you. Now, I might not have written exactly that same explanation, but am I on the same sort of points? But crucially, did I write as much as that in terms of content? Maybe not the same number of words, but did I cover that amount of content? If so, I'm likely to have done enough to explain myself. On to the most useful document then that is prepared around these past exam papers. And here it is, the examiner's report. They publish this after each exam sitting, and it is gold dust. The reason it's so useful is it gives you general comments about things that people did well and did badly, but it goes through each individual question and picks out things that good students did well and weaker students missed out on. Here's part D, the question that we looked at. And it tells us our students answered this poorly and gives us an explanation of the things that people did poorly. And what's happening there? That's the examiner saying, look, students did that badly in the past. And therefore, that may well be something that I examine again in the future. It's giving you a bit of insight into the examiner's mind. So it's really worth reading in detail around the questions that you've answered because it gives you an insight into the things you should continue to do and the things students did badly, things you'd want to address.
Hi everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. It's absolutely fantastic. So much really excellent advice in there. I particularly love the section at the end on marking your own answer. Ben, I wonder if it's just worth reflecting a little bit on the types of questions that the audience has been asking, what that's telling you, and any final words of advice from you.
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for all of the questions. We've had absolutely loads. I'd say that they fall into 2 or 3 broad themes. One, a lot of questions on the same area, which is around the examiner's model answers. And the examiner's model answers being so big and being almost demoralizing. How do I know how much I need to write? The examiner's model answer is so big. How do I write that amount in the time that's available? And really, that's the answer to that is a mindset change. You are not trying to write out the examiner's model answers. They're there as a reference tool. And if you had forever to write your answer, you could write the amount that they write. But in the real world, where you've got just over 1.8 minutes per mark, you cannot hope to write in the same way that the examiner does. So my tip for you is look at the number of marks available. Let's say that's 10 marks. And you're thinking, I need 1 or 2 sentences per mark. So if it's a 10-mark question, I'm looking to make 10 points, and each one of those points is 1 to 2 sentences. So I'm looking at a maximum of 20 sentences for a 10-mark question. Any more than that is you don't need to write any more than that to score the marks that are available. The examiner's model answers are not there for you to rote learn and try to reproduce. They're there as a reference tool. And so it's really important that you realise that. So that's one area of questions. The next area of questions was about the paper-based exam and how do I plan in the paper-based exam. Now, I would encourage you, if you're doing the paper-based version, to show that marker will be impressed if you have planned, because most students don't, and it's really obvious in the waffly style in which they write. Now, I would encourage you to do your plan in the answer booklet so that it gets submitted so that the marker is impressed by the fact that you are organised and you have good exam technique. So I would start with the answer plan, and then I'm writing up my answer underneath it. And I'm making it very clear what I'm doing. I'm writing the word plan at the top, and then I'm writing up my points underneath. Another question that came through a group of questions, so the third group of questions, was about what order do I need to do the exam in? Now, the examiner's guidance is that you should do it from start to finish. So you should start in section A, and you should work your way through the exam paper. And if you are somebody who doesn't struggle with time management, I would agree with that. That is the right way to do this paper. But if you're somebody who struggles for time, and particularly if English isn't your first language, the first question can be overwhelming. There's so much information in there, such a big, long scenario, that some students just spend forever trying to get their head around the scenario in section A. And because they've got all the time of the exam still left at that point, they end up wasting far too much time there in section A. So for students that struggle with their timings, actually it can be much more effective to start with section B, because they're shorter scenarios, shorter requirements, and therefore it's easier to stay on track. And then doing section B first means that you come to the longer question with, well, whatever your balance of time that is available. I had a few people as well picking up on the point of, quite often part D or part E is the easier part of the question. Do I have to start with part A of the question? And I would say for that, if you're running out of time, so let's say you get to the last question in the exam and there's only 5 minutes left, pick the one where you think you could pick up the most marks, and that's very often the later ones. It can make your answer a bit disjointed, though. If you do part E, then you do part B, then you do part A, then you do part C. Sometimes students who write like that or answer like that, their answer gets a little bit all over the place and it gets a little bit confused. So I tend to answer the question in order. You saw me there doing part E of that question, which was the ethics part. I picked that out because it was really good for demonstrating technique. But I wouldn't necessarily have started with part E or part D or whatever that was. I would tend to work through a question in order. But I am definitely thinking about starting with section B. And I'm very mindful that the easier marks come towards the end, and I need to make sure I get there with enough time. I just want to look if there are any more of the sort of general question type. So we had some. I did have other, most of the questions were about exam technique, but there were a couple of questions on more sort of technical topics, particularly around audit risk, and how do I know I've written enough to explain my audit risk for 3 marks? And it's coming back to the same point, really. How do you know you've written enough? Well, you need 1 or 2 sentences per mark. So if it is a 3-mark audit risk point, then I need 3 separate points within it. And each one of those to be written up with 1 or 2 sentences. So I'm looking at, for a really well-explained audit risk, I'm looking at making kind of 4, 5, maybe even 6 sentences covering at least 3 different ideas. So in conclusion, what I'd be encouraging you to do from here is as much question practice as possible. For you to develop exam speed, you need to train yourself. Think of this like running a marathon. You need to practice the doing questions to time. It's so important. And so what I'd be encouraging you to do, at this stage, I'm probably just doing questions, like whole questions. So I'm doing a 25-mark question, and I'm going to do it to time. And I'm practicing doing it to time, fully writing up my answer. And then as I get a bit closer to the exam, I'm starting to do full exam papers to time. Practicing that technique of managing the 3 hours and 15 minutes. How do I use that time effectively? Well, for a lot of students, unless they're doing lots of mock exam papers and lots of full exam papers to time, it can, on the day of the exam, you're not kind of used to that skill of having to manage your time across the paper. So for the next week or so, I'm doing exam questions to time. And then as it gets closer to the exam, I'm doing full exam papers to time. So I'm spending half a day at a time doing my revision work. Okay. That's our time for this session. Thanks everyone for your attention today. I hope you found the session useful.